The administration of Donald Trump has officially invited the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to the G20 summit, which will be held this year in Miami, USA. This was announced today by Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Pankin. But besides him, in recent weeks there have been enough signals that Trump might actually take such a step. For example, Vladimir Putin's envoy Kirill Dmitriev practically never leaves Miami, where he is constantly negotiating with Donald Trump's close friend Stephen Witkoff, who was pushing for a peace deal unfavorable to Ukraine. In addition, in recent days we've seen that Trump's team is desperately looking for ridiculous excuses as to why they've once again extended the lifting of sanctions on Russian oil. Moreover, it's known that Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner are once again heading to Moscow for a meeting with Putin. So let's discuss all the background to how Donald Trump's administration is trying to bring the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to the most important summit in the world, that is, the G20 summit. I'm Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave any comment on this video, and subscribe to my Telegram. The link is in this video's description. So, Russia was invited to participate in the G20 summit at the highest level. This was reported by Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Pankin. The summit will take place in December 2026 in Miami, that is, in the United States of America. And here is a quote from Pankin. "There is an invitation to attend at the highest level, but we will see closer to the date." I would like to note here that when we talk about a visit at the highest level, it means an invitation specifically for the president of the country. In this case, the bold dictator Vladimir Putin. And now the Kremlin is increasingly trying to show that Putin is really expected in Miami. Earlier, Russia's G20 Sherpa Svetlana Lukash stated that the US is preparing for the possible arrival of Russian President Vladimir Putin at the event, and they are counting on his participation. Of Stran G20. Earlier, Vladimir Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov stated that Russia is interested in continuing to work with the G20, but so far no decision has been made on who will represent Russia at the G20 summit. And here is a quote from Peskov. "No decision has been made yet regarding Putin's participation in the G20 summit in the US, but Russia has participated in every summit at the appropriate level. We will decide on our participation format closer to the summit. Moscow continues its G20 work." And I would like to note here that the last time Vladimir Putin attended the G20 summit in person was in Japan back in 2019. In 2022, 2023, and 2024, the Russian delegation was headed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov. In 2025, Russia was represented by the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Presidential Administration, Maxim Oreshkin. As for Vladimir Putin himself, well, sorry, he's just afraid to come out of his bunker. He's a cowardly jerk who's really scared to appear in public. The thing is, last year the G20 summit actually took place in South Africa, and hypothetically Vladimir Putin could have gone there in person, but he was afraid that he would be arrested under the warrant issued by the International Criminal Court for his bloody crime against Ukraine, and against the Ukrainian people, including the abduction of Ukrainian children. But this time Donald Trump can actually prepare a grand reception for Vladimir Putin in Miami. Since the US is not a participant in the International Criminal Court because they did not ratify the Rome Statute, and in 2002 they officially withdrew their signature from it. Washington fundamentally does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court over its own citizens and military personnel, fearing politically motivated prosecutions, and actively opposes the investigations of this court. The question is to find out whether Donald Trump recognizes the jurisdiction. That is exactly why this bold excuse for a man is free from the criminal court. Last year, besides, the Kremlin understands perfectly well how to turn Donald Trump against Europe and how to team up with him. And in recent days, as you know, Russia has been actively claiming that it is Europe that is preparing for a big war. But Donald Trump is doing everything he can to oppose Europe's warlike sentiments. Well, for example, Shoigu is the former Minister of Defense of Russia, and now he is the Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation. He warned Finland and the Baltic countries the day before that Russia might attack them because of alleged flights of Ukrainian drones over their territory to strike Russia. Next, I will quote Shoigu. Recently, there have been more cases when strikes by Ukrainian drones against Russia are carried out through Finland and the countries that, well, as uneducated Russians call them, Pribaltica, although the correct term is the Baltic countries. As a result, civilians suffer and significant damage is caused to civilian infrastructure. This can happen in two cases, either due to the ineffectiveness of Western air defense systems or the deliberate provision of their airspace by these countries. In the latter case, according to international law, the Russians remembered international law, Article 51 of the UN Charter comes into effect, which concerns the inherent right of states to self-defense in the event of armed attack. And today, the Kremlin has come up with a new story. The deputy head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Alexander Grushko, stated that European countries are rehearsing scenarios for a naval blockade and the seizure of the Kaliningrad region during the exercises of the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is led by the United Kingdom. According to him, the activity of European military forces responsible for rapid response in the Arctic, the North Atlantic and the Baltic Sea has been increasing in recent years. I wonder why that is. Maybe it's because there are wild Russians living next door? Grushko also recalled the NATO operation Baltic Watch, which was launched after the severing of energy and communication cables on the floor of the Baltic Sea. And now a representative of the Russian Foreign Ministry has called its true goal the control of international transport routes and the restriction of cargo transportation carried out in the interests of the Russian Federation. Well, now let's recall who is part of these joint expeditionary force. These are the United Kingdom, of course, as well as Denmark, Finland, Estonia, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Sweden and Norway. The coalition was established in 2015 to respond quickly to crises, deter threats, and conduct operations mainly in the Baltic Sea and High North regions. And this happened after unwashed Russia unleashed a full-scale war against Ukraine. Besides, it leans toward cooperation specifically with these Eastern and Northern European NATO members. That's why the Kremlin is trying to show that it's ready to attack these very countries, to create tension that can then be bravely resolved during a new personal meeting between Trump and Putin. But besides all this, it's worth noting that the White House is being a little too suspiciously accommodating toward the Kremlin. As you know, Trump lifted sanctions against Russia, Russian oil, a month ago, and now this. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that he extended the exemption from oil sanctions against Russia and Iran after requests from what he called vulnerable countries affected by the blockade of the Hormuz Strait. He said this during a Senate hearing, but he never mentioned which mysterious countries were asking him to lift sanctions on Russia. During the hearing before the Budget Committee, Democratic Senator Chris Coons asked the U.S. Treasury Secretary why the administration initially refused to extend the easing of oil sanctions against Russia, but then suddenly renewed the exemption from the restrictions. Let me remind you that the previous lifting of sanctions ended on April 11, and it seemed like the Treasury said, "That's it, we won't extend it." But on April 16, they suddenly extended it. Coons noted that Russia is additionally earning $150 million in revenue daily. And this money is used not only to kill Ukrainians, but also for Russia to use its income to support Iran with drones and intelligence, so that now American soldiers are being killed as well. And regarding all this, the US Secretary of the Treasury admitted that yes, Russia has profited from the lifting of sanctions, although earlier, let me remind you, this same Bessent stated that no, don't think that way, of course we lifted the sanctions, but Russia still won't earn anything. At the same time, he stated that without this, global oil prices would have already reached $150 per barrel instead of $100, so supposedly American consumers benefited from this. Also, according to Bessent, the US decided to further ease sanctions against Russia and Iran because of requests from about 10 countries that suffered from the global rise in energy prices. He added that Washington did not plan to make such a decision, but about 10 countries begged Donald Trump very strongly, and Trump said, "Well, what can I do? I don't really want to lift the sanctions against Russia, but they're asking me, so what can I do?" And next I'll quote Scott Bessent. Last week was the week of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and on Wednesday I was convinced that we wouldn't do it, meaning we wouldn't extend the lifting of sanctions. But representatives from more than 10 countries approached me, countries that are the most vulnerable and poorest in terms of energy, and so they asked us to extend the lifting of these sanctions. When asked which countries these were, Bessent for some reason did not answer, so I can assume that no one actually requested this from Bessent. This is entirely the Trump administration's own decision. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so financially by donating through the links and details in the description of this video or by using the QR code on your screens. Thank you for any support. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.